Should the 70 weeks prophecy be understood as 490 days, 490 years, or an indefinite period of time? In this video, you'll find out. Reminder to hit the subscribe button below and turn on the notification bell to stay up to date as new videos come out. And if you're interested in supporting this ministry, just go to justscripture.org and click on the support page. So far in our chapter 9 journey, we've seen that the 70-year Babylonian exile, as predicted by Jeremiah, is drawing to a close. That prompted Daniel to pray on behalf of all Israel for God to restore the Jews back into the promised land, by namely asking for Jerusalem and the temple to be rebuilt, during which Gabriel shows up to provide Daniel with God's answer to his prayer that is spelled out in the 70 weeks prophecy. Keeping the context as a driver to our understanding is that the 6 outcomes of the prophecy would be accomplished at the ushering in of God's kingdom on earth. This was most evidently seen in point 4, as the everlasting language is connected with chapter 2 and 7's description of the everlasting kingdom being established by God, thus making 9:24 messianic. And a passing note to remember here is that chapters 2 through 7 are in Aramaic, while chapters 8 through 12 switch back into Hebrew. So let's now begin to build our understanding on what exactly the 70 weeks are, verses 24 through 27. 70 weeks are determined upon thy people and upon thy holy city, to finish the transgression, to make an end to sins, to make reconciliation for iniquity, to bring in everlasting righteousness, to seal up vision and prophecy, to anoint the most holy. Know therefore and understand that from the going forth of the commandment to restore and to build Jerusalem unto the Messiah the Prince shall be 7 weeks and 62 weeks. The street shall be built again, and the wall even in troublous times. And after 62 weeks shall Messiah be cut off, but not for himself. And the people of the prince that shall come destroy the city and the sanctuary, and the end thereof with a flood, and unto the end of the war desolations are determined. And he shall confirm the covenant with many for 1 week, and in the midst of the week he shall cause the sacrifice and the oblation to cease. And for the overspreading of abominations he shall make it desolate, even until the consummation, and that determined shall be poured upon the desolate. In all 4 verses we see weeks being referenced. 70 in verse 24, then 7 weeks and 62 weeks in 25. Then it describes events taking place after the set of 62 weeks, and then finally 1 week in verse 27. The most natural and correct way to see these verses is that verse 24 encompasses the total length being 70 weeks, with its intended purpose being described. Then verses 25, 26, and 27 are the events that are to occur within the 70 weeks, as verse 25 contains 69 of the weeks with 2 sets. Verse 26 describes events taking place after the prior set of 62 weeks is completed, and verse 27 contains 1 week worth of events. Now, before some of you start losing your mind over what I just said, is that yes, I will be discussing verse 25's punctuation and translation issues, and yes, I understand that after 69 comes 70. We'll be discussing all that in detail like usual. The only point that I am trying to make here is that verses 25 through 27 fall within the scope of 24 and do not come chronologically after verse 24 by creating 2 sets of 70 weeks. This has actually been presented as a possibility, but fails because the first 70 are said to be ending with 6 great positive outcomes, including everlasting righteousness. But then 70 weeks of hardship take place with really terrible events happening for the nation of Israel. Now, because of an example like that, and numerous other ones that we'll see put on display, is that our good old critical friend James Montgomery famously referred to the 70 weeks as a dismal swamp. But there is one thing that Monty and I do agree on, and that is that the prophecy is being given in straightforward prose language, in that it sounds no differently than the earlier portions of the chapter. Gabriel is talking to Daniel in straight language. Jimmy said, "The attempt to pursue and reconstruct a metrical form merely complicates the study of the passage. The passage is essentially prosaic, and the best that can be done is to cast it into lines, and so obtain the appearance of free verse." And why that is so important is that when we get to verse 27, is that the he is undefined in the verse, which means we're going to have to make a textual decision on the identity of who the character is. So let's continue on our quest by biblically defining what a week is. Our Hebrew word here is Shavua. Outside of chapter 9, it is used 2 more times in chapter 10 when old man Daniel is said to have been fasting for 3 weeks. The context, and logic for that matter, makes it really understood to be referring to 21 days. So, if we were to define the weeks as days in chapter 9, it would mean that we are working with 490 total days, or just over a year and 4 months period. So verse 25's 69 weeks then would be 483 days. That would involve the complete rebuilding of the demolished Jerusalem while being opposed in the process. Is that realistically possible? It's very, very, very unlikely to happen, but let's just say everyone was that motivated to get it done, although we already know that it didn't happen from the books of Ezra, Nehemiah, Haggai, and Zechariah. But really how the defining of the weeks as days really fails is that there are only 7 days left for everything in verses 26 and 27 to occur in. You would need a covenant being confirmed on Sunday, by Tuesday an anointed person be cut off, daily sacrifices ceased on Wednesday, Thursday the temple is desolated, and by the end of the week the whole city and temple has been destroyed once again, just 7 days later after the rebuilding of all of it. Sorry, this dog simply does not hunt. And very likely many of you are wondering why I would go through it this way. For one, it is simply to show you the absurdity in equating the weeks with days. And 2 is to give you a visual reminder to remember on, because at some point you might come across a person or group that tries to make it out to be days while completely disregarding all the events that are said to take place within those periods. Which now begs the question is if Shavua is internally defined anywhere else in the Old Testament other than for days. And the answer is no. You might have been prone to think that Jacob's story of Mary and Leah and Rachel supports a 7-year period because you have Shavua mentioned twice and there are references to Jacob's 7 years of labor for Rachel. Then after he got duped by Laban on his wedding night, that he had to agree to work another 7 years if he still wanted Rachel. Looks tempting, but when Laban said to Jacob that he needs to fulfill her week, is that he's referring to the week-long wedding feast tradition of those days. We see this tradition played out again in the story of Samson marrying a Philistine girl. So, there is no example of Shavua being used as a different length of time in the Old Testament. But still, there's no logical way to envision all these events taking place in a span of just under a year and a half. And by now, I can imagine that most of you are thinking, duh, it can't be days, and that's why we all know it refers to weeks of years. Because even from the critical view, the span of time from Cyrus to Antiochus is almost 400 years. So, only a 490-year period makes logical sense for all the events to take place within, but that doesn't negate the fact that nearly all of its uses have a week as a period of 7 days and none as a period of 7 years. Which now begs the question, how is it that nearly everyone understands that it is referring to weeks of years? Or maybe the real question should be, is would have Daniel understood them as weeks of years or not? Now, the biggest point that I hope you took away from all that is that it's not as straightforward as you might have been taught before. I'm not saying that we can't get there, but that it's not on the surface level for us to simply just go 70 times 7 and that makes 490, and let's start plotting some points on a timeline. And that's why there are commentators who simply say that the 70 weeks are an indefinite period of time that simply can't be pinned down. I'm not going to dismiss that as a possibility, but the fact that verses 25 through 27 break down the 70 weeks into 3 different time periods, whose sum is 70, doesn't lend itself very well for them to be seen as indefinite periods. And Daniel was coming off of 70 literal years of Babylonian exile. So him receiving a prophecy like this likely wasn't going to register as though they are just symbolic in nature. So if we're going to arrive at 490 years, then there better be good textual and contextual reasons for it. Now, there's 2 routes that can be taken here to arrive at 490 years. The first is based upon the context of chapter 9 and the rest of the prophecies in Daniel. And the other involves applying a principle outside of Daniel to it. And if you don't know what I'm already referring to here, it's that it's commonly called the day-year principle. Advocates of this principle will cite Numbers 14:34 and Ezekiel 4:5-6 as justification. Numbers 14:34 came as the result of Israel's complaining against God's provision and refusal to enter the promised land after the false report came back to the camp. If they would have just trusted God, that generation that did cross the Red Sea, for that matter, would have gotten to go in. But since they never stopped complaining, God said the following: "Your carcasses shall fall in this wilderness, and all that were numbered of you, according to your whole number, from 20 years old and upward, which have murmured against me. And your children shall wander in the wilderness 40 years, and bear your whoredoms until your carcasses be wasted in the wilderness." Now here comes God's reason for 40 years. "After the number of the days in which you search the land, that is 40 days, each day for a year, shall you bear your iniquities for 40 years. And you shall know what it means to breach my promise." So, God said they're getting 40 years because of their 40 days of nonstop complaining, lack of faith, and refusal to go into the promised land. The other cited reference in Ezekiel is with him being told to lie on his left side for 390 days and 40 days on his right side. That represented the years of their iniquity, as God said at the end of verse 6, "I have appointed thee each day for a year." So, with these 2 examples, that some groups will say that this shows that a prophetic day equals a year. And since Daniel's 70 weeks are 490 prophetic days, that we should then apply this principle to the 490 days, that then becomes 490 years. Proponents will continue to say that it forms an undivided period of 490 years, and typically have it falling from 457 BC to 34 AD, and you subtract out 1 year because there is no year 0. The endpoints here could be nudged back by a year, but I think you get the point. Ezra 7's decree is their starting point for the rebuilding of Jerusalem. 33 or 34 AD marks the end of the 70 weeks, with either Stephen being stoned to death or Paul's conversion. Then going back 7 years from this, you would be at 27 AD, that is typically marked out as the year of Jesus' baptism and the start of his ministry. And as most understand Jesus' ministry lasting around 3.5 years, that 31 AD would be the year of his crucifixion. Then the proponent would refer back to 927's statement that in the midst of the week, that he shall cause the sacrifice and the oblation to cease, as referring to Jesus' sacrifice on the cross and the ending of the sacrificial system. This interpretation makes the he in this verse referring to the Messiah that was mentioned in verses 25 and 26. Just FYI here is that this timeline is used by others as well. It's not just those who convert days into years with the day-year principle. Now, I'm not going to break down this timeline in this video because we're focusing on how to properly define and understand the 70 weeks. But for the moment, we're going to go veering off and look at some real abuses in history from that used the day-year principle and is even still used today by some groups. So I just need you to follow the thinking here for a moment. If Daniel's 70 weeks worked out prophetically and historically this way, then why can't say the 2,300 days in chapter 8 be referring to 2,300 years? And that the sanctuary to be cleansed is actually referring to the whole earth in the attempt to get us back to Eden. That would then be the point of ushering in God's kingdom on earth and be the point of Jesus' second coming. Think I'm kidding? Enter William Miller. He took this concept and applied it to the 2,300 evenings and mornings, mind you, because the word day is not used in 8:14. It's actually Arab and Boker. Then turned them into years using the day-year principle, then started from the same 457 BC date that you then arrive at 1844 AD as the year for Christ's return to cleanse the earth, thus giving rise to the Adventist movement in the early to mid-19th century in America. Miller's first prediction was a general span of a year between 1843 and 1844. When that didn't work out, he shifted the return date to an exact date of April 18th, 1844. And when that failed, he shifted the date once again to only 6 months later on October 22nd. And once again, his prediction failed. And with so many people seeing the failure of their prophet over and over again, that October 22nd, 1844 is known today as the Great Disappointment. Now you would think that from repeated failed prophecy predictions that adherents would have woken up and thrown in the towel on such a movement, especially since Jesus said, "But of that day and hour knoweth no man, no, not the angels of heaven, but my Father only." And even before his ascension, he told the disciples again, "It is not for you to know the times or the seasons which the Father hath put in his own power." But sadly, the answer is no, the Adventist movement did not end there. It actually ended up fractured into many splinter groups, with the Seventh-day Adventists being the most well-known today, the Christadelphians, another well-known group, and FYI, they are Unitarians, and also Charles Taze Russell's Bible Students Group that eventually became the Watchtower Society, i.e. the Jehovah's Witnesses. Now, you might have been wondering, how did such a movement become so popular so quickly anyways? Because that group roped in a lot of people. And the reason why they were so successful was because there was a lot of day-year application going on at the turn of the 18th century. You see, there's multiple verses that appear to be speaking of the same length of time between Daniel and Revelation. So, if 3.5 years equals the 42 months and 1,260 days in Revelation, is that 1,260 prophetic years are envisioned here. And with that, you had multiple views being developed and popularized by many well-known Protestant leaders because namely they saw the Roman Catholic Church as the woman who rides the beast in Revelation and the Pope as the present Antichrist figure in the world. And out of those views, the one that became the most popular then and still used today by some is Emperor Justinian's decree of papal supremacy in 538 all the way to Pope Pius VI capture in 1798. So you can imagine that if this was quite popular across Protestant circles, that you should then naturally be expecting the kingdom arriving soon as the Pope, i.e. the Antichrist, was defeated in Rome. So it's just a matter of time really to when somebody is going to come around and say that they know the exact day and year for Jesus' return by using the same method that all the other great reformers were using, and presto, you got a second coming movement gaining large popularity. So I hope you can see why the method that one uses to come to the conclusion that the 70 weeks are 490 years is rather important, because you just saw that a view can take a person down a path that ends in catastrophic results. Now, does their abuses necessarily mean that the day-year principle applied to the 70 weeks is wrong? As of right now, no. But if the other approach is found exegetically sound based upon chapter 9 itself, and connects properly into the rest of Daniel for that matter, then it will be dismissed as inappropriate. Always remember, the end does not justify the means. Now, how to determine this requires us to go back and take a deeper dive into Daniel's use of Shavua. When you look at the use between chapters 9 and 10, is that it appears as though they were worded the same in the original Hebrew. But that's not actually the case. Both highlighted phrases in 10, 2, and 3 have the word yom in it, which is literally the word day in Hebrew. But in the Hebrew, that is read from right to left, is that the word day comes after weeks. So it literally reads 3 weeks of days. And you will see it worded this way in Young's literal translation. And the same occurs in verse 3, with Young's again saying 3 weeks a days. What Daniel did here was qualify what type of weeks these were. So he is using weeks here as a unit of 7, commonly referred to as a heptad. This would be like us using the word dozen today. If I said, I have a dozen, you're going to ask, 3 dozen of what? I would then qualify it by saying eggs. But I bet you had already done the math in your head, knowing that a dozen is a unit of 12 multiplied by 3 equaling 36. You just didn't know 36 of what until I qualified it. So the same thing goes for 10, 2, and 3, in that it's 3 times 7 units of days, equaling 21 total days for Daniel's fast. And you see it similarly done in Ezekiel 45:21 with the Feast of Unleavened Bread lasting for 1 week of days. But back in Daniel 9, he didn't qualify any of them, which now begs the question, why did he do it in the very next verses in chapter 10, but not in 9? The only answer that makes sense is that he was making sure that the reader knew that his fasting weeks did not carry the same unit of time as they did in chapter 9, which again only logically leaves years for us to use. And although Daniel didn't write it as weeks of years, as he did with weeks of days, is that he didn't have to do so because Daniel was already thinking in terms of years from reading Jeremiah's 70-year prophecy. So when Gabriel said 70 weeks are now determined for thy people, that Daniel instantly knew that he was speaking of 70 weeks of years, totaling 490 altogether. So, as Jeremiah's 70 years were about to conclude, is that Daniel's 490 years were announced to let him know that the full restoration of the people and reviving of the Davidic kingdom that he was yearning for wasn't going to happen until his 70 weeks prophecy was completed, with Gabriel breaking down the events that are going to take place within them. And this example of using the context to qualify what the unit of 7 was referring to isn't without precedent, because the same can be seen with the Hebrew word ashor. In Genesis, it was used as a unit of 10 in being a decade of days. In Exodus, it is used in reference to the 10th day of the month on which to celebrate. The catch here is that yom is not involved. Only the Hebrew word for month is. But we know from the context that it's obviously talking about the 10th day. And there are many more examples of this type of use in the Old Testament. But 3 times it is used in Psalms where they all go unqualified. But since all of them were used in praising context with the use of chorded instruments, is that we understand it to be talking about an unnamed 10-string instrument. So the same type of threefold use can be seen here, as ashor could be a 10-day period or be used as a unit of 10 where the context drives what it is referring to, just like with Daniel's 70 weeks. So we see 490 years fills in vertically on our chart just fine, which now begs the question is if there are any horizontal connections that would solidify our interpretation that the weeks are in fact weeks of years? And the answer is yes. To find that connection is that it involves the same process that we talked about back in chapter 9 study of aligning the four beasts with the statue by reversing out from God's kingdom, then plot the four beasts from the fourth to the first to find their horizontal alignment with the statue of metals. This alignment was confirmed by the 10 toes and 10 horns being equal to one another. But chapter 7's vision revealed more of what was to take place at the end of the Fourth Empire's reign, as an 11th king, also known as the Little Horn, will rise in power by overtaking 3 of the 10 ruling kings. Verse 25 said that he will then go after God's people. The angel then went on by saying that the 11th king's persecution will last 3.5 years, as deduced from the phrase time, times, and half a time. Then, at the end of those 3.5 years, the Son of Man will come down riding on clouds to slay the beast and the little horn, and usher in God's everlasting kingdom on earth. A 3.5 year period is exactly what we see in 927 as the middle of the 1 week, i.e. 7 years, is at the 3.5 year point, which is further harmonized by the ushering in of God's everlasting kingdom at the conclusion of the 70 weeks. Now, knowing how important and possibly game-changing this alignment is for some of you out there, is that this interpretation is nailed down for us by going to the end of the book in chapter 12. Because 12:1 says that there shall be a time of trouble for God's people, but those who are found in the book will be delivered. In 12:7, we are told that this time of trouble is for a time, times, and a half. Obviously the same as 7:25. Verse 11. And from the time that the daily sacrifice shall be taken away, and the abomination that maketh desolate set up, there shall be 1,290 days. Right there, we have time, times, and a half a times specified as 1,290 days. There's no ambiguity to the matter now. Verse 12. Blessed is he that waiteth and cometh to 1,335 days. Now, what is up with those extra 45 days here is something we'll talk about when we get there. But it actually doubles down for us right now in that it is only talking about a regular 24-hour day, and that there is no need or justification for them to be converted to years using the day-year principle. So, chapter 12, specifying that it is 1,290 days for the little horn's oppression to last, is that this connects all the way back to chapter 7. And when you divide 1,290 days by 365.25, you get 3.5 years. And a simple comparison of 927 and 1211 is that you see the exact same events taking place in both, thus not allowing for someone to possibly claim that chapter 9's half a week period of oppression is somehow different than chapter 7 or 12's time, times, and half a time period of oppression. That all of which culminate with God's people being vindicated and ruled in everlasting righteousness. So, regardless of how scriptural or historical all these fancy-looking charts may appear to be, is that you now know that none of them are exegetically sound, nor have any of their predictions been shown to be historically true. And that is why we need to continue to let Daniel interpret Daniel and build our chart according to what was revealed to him by God, so that we don't become susceptible to the next William Miller who comes around saying that he knows when the Lord is going to return. Reminder, hit the subscribe button below, turn on the notification bell, hit the like button, leave a comment, and don't forget to visit us at justscripture.org. But in the meantime, stay salty.